Welcome to this week's edition of the MBN Iran podcast. With me today is Shahin Milani, the Executive Director of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. Shahin, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start off by talking about the fact that we're in July 2026 and everybody's focused on the war, understandably, back and forth about Strait of Hormuz, disagreements, bombing on both sides, and so on. But a lot of people lost their lives back in January in Iran, and at the time it received a lot of attention, brief flurry of attention, and then it kind of went away. And one of the concerns that I have had is that it's as if it never happened. The world moved on, it moved on to the war, yet thousands of people lost their lives. And in my newsletter, the twice weekly newsletter that comes out, the MBN Iran Briefing, last week, I looked in more detail at what happened 6 months ago. And that's why I want to talk to you today and start off by talking about what actually happened now that we've had 6 months for the dust to settle. As hard as it is to get information from inside Iran, how would you describe what happened on those days at the beginning of January of this year?
All right. Thank you very much, Andres, for having me on your show. Well, to start with, I believe, and I think many other observers believe, that the massacre that took place on January 8th and January 9th, 2026 in Iran is perhaps the worst massacre in Iran's modern history. That's not a overstatement, I believe. It's thousands of people were killed, and we don't still know how many. The death toll, various figures have been announced. The government itself published a report. It listed the names of more than 3,000 people. Other NGOs like Hirana, they stated that they had 7,000 names, but I think they published around 4,000 names. But the scale of it is just, I think it goes way beyond that. Maybe 10,000 people, maybe 20,000 people, maybe even more. Some have announced like 30 or 40,000 people as well. We just don't know. But whatever the final number, there's no doubt in my mind that it's the worst massacre in Iran's modern history. The previous, record, if you may, was set in 1988 when thousands of political prisoners were massacred. But that was over several weeks, maybe a couple of months. But this one, the worst of the killings took place over 2 days. And then the country immediately went into a complete internet shutdown. So it was very hard to get reports of what happened. And then the government has this way of pressuring the families, threatening them, so they wouldn't release any information about their loved ones who were killed. So, after all this time, there are still new names that we hear about, but we don't know, and maybe we will never find out the actual true number. But just geographically, it was, across almost all provinces of the country, and the security forces just opened fire directly at people, shooting directly at their heads and their hearts. There was no hiding it, and it was clear that they were shooting to kill. And kill they did. They killed thousands upon thousands of people, and we still don't know. And of course, because of the internet shutdown, right, it was very difficult to get information out. And this is a situation that happens. The government, of course, they have no morality, right? They're not concerned about any considerations about truth or being objective. They just disseminate their own propaganda. But for us in the human rights community, we have to speak based on evidence. And when there is an internet shutdown, and even subsequently during the war, even calling Iran was difficult. It's very difficult for us to gather reliable information that we could report on. So that creates a space in which the government can basically disseminate its own propaganda, and we're in the human rights world. We're left with statements that we say we just don't know. We have to wait until we know the final count. But whatever, we just know that thousands of people were killed, and then many others were blinded. We still don't know how many. I believe in the hundreds, maybe thousands of people have suffered eye injuries because in the very first days, hospitals in Tehran and other cities, they reported that they have operated on many individuals under eyes. So there are numerous eye injuries, and then large number of arrests. And we've had several executions of people who were involved in the protest as well, and that continues to this day.
I mean, the numbers are shocking. We, of course, as you said, will never know the reality, or unlikely. Maybe one day we will. But besides the numbers, do you think that they approached this differently as well? Like, does it compare with how they responded to the Women Life Freedom protests, or what's different this time?
Yes, I think this time they perceive the protest as a bigger threat to them. Whereas the previous rounds of protests, they were more spontaneous, and they happened without a specific political leader. This time around, on January 8th and January 9th, as you know, the former Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi, he issued a call for people to go to the streets on January 8th and January 9th at 8 p.m. And people responded to that, and they went out to the streets. And I think because this time the government felt that they were facing a more organized political threat to their rule, I think they responded with the highest level of violence that they had. During the Women Life Freedom protests of 2022, I think the count of people who were killed, like after 3 or 4 months, it stood at maybe 400, 500, something like that. Still, even during the Women Life Freedom protests, the deadliest incident took place in Zahedan on September 30th, 2022, and one day they killed 100 people. So it wasn't that it wasn't bloodied. I mean, one day they killed 100 people in Zahedan, which is it's a provincial capital, but it's not a major city compared to Tehran and Mashhad. So they were willing to use extreme violence as they did in that day in Zahedan, but that was more localized. They didn't deploy that sort of violence across the country. I mean, overall they killed 400 to 500 people. It's still a lot of people, but I think they were not perceiving as big a threat. The bigger, again, another very deadly episode happened in 2019 when the government suddenly tripled the price of fuel. In November 2019, again, hundreds of people were killed. I think Amnesty International had compiled a list of 300 something people, but there were reports that the number of the dead stood maybe at 1,500. That was a report published by Reuters, quoting Iranian government officials. So again, even in November 2019, we don't know the final death toll. And that happened over 3 days. It was very deadly. They just wanted to put it down. But still, the January 2026 massacre, I think, is far beyond anything we'd seen before. I think mainly because they really felt that, okay, if they didn't do that, their existence was in danger and they could be toppled by a mass revolt. And keep in mind that this round of protests that culminated on January 8th and 9th, it had started in, I think, on December 28th, if I'm not mistaken. It started in the bazaar of Tehran, and then it spread to other cities. And by January 8th, I think the government had already killed, I think, about 35 to 40 people across, within that 10 days across the country. So the violence was going on, but it just crescendo on January 8th and 9th, and they were just, from the reports that we got, they were just aiming at the heads and shooting to kill.
How do you, so obviously documentation is in the name of your organization. How do you document? Because look at the difficulties, internet shutdowns, people are afraid and so on. Can you talk us through a bit about how you actually document?
Well, there are different facets to it. One of it is just open source data, which are like, videos shot by people inside Iran, and then we verify those videos. That's one facet of it. And then another facet of it is just the statements by government officials themselves that, they make announcements. So that's open source data. And then there's interviewing witnesses that have witnessed the events. Of course, we interviewed some people who were inside the country but left. So they're outside Iran now. We've interviewed those witnesses who were on the streets on those days, and then they left in subsequent days. And then after like we've interviewed, for example, relatives of individuals who were killed in Iran. So they would tell us what happened to loved ones. For example, Mr. Afshari, he's in Germany. His young son was in Iran. He was killed. So his son was a teenager. So he told the story of his son to us, and and others as well who their families were outside Iran. But we've also been able to, once internet got back, we were also able to speak to some witnesses inside the country as well.
One of the difficulties, obviously, is you're documenting what the regime is doing, and the regime keeps doing it, right? And now we have the kind of ascendancy of the IRGC, even more than, with even more power perhaps than they had prior to the past few months. So where is this all headed? Like, can this happen again? Can people actually even do what they did on December 28th? The rial, for example, the exchange rate, the plummeting in the exchange rate, which actually you could argue was one of the triggers for what happened on December 28th. Well, the rial is worth a lot less now, actually, almost 30% less than back in December when the protest started. So arguably protests would start again, but it's not looking like that's going to happen. So how is it that people, in your view, are going to be able to express, protest, express their points of view and so on in what's already a repressive regime? Where do you see all this headed?
Well, I believe protests will spring up again at some point in the future, maybe in the next few months, maybe in the next year or so. Of course, it's very hard to predict exactly when, but the pattern of these past few years, since 2017, has been, every couple of years there's been a round of protests. We had protests in 2017, in 18, in 2019, and then we had 2022, and then we had 2026. Those are the major protests. And then, we've had more localized protests in between as well. So, given the economic situation, I think that it's just that the people, so there are some people who might feel that they don't have anything to lose. So it's possible that At some point, protests will ensue again. And the experience of the past few years, I mean, yes, the massacre of 2026 was exceptionally brutal. But in one sense, it wasn't new. People who went to the streets, they knew that there was some risk of being killed. And, like the people who went to the streets on January 9th, they knew that many of them knew what had happened the day before. They had seen shots being fired, but they went out again on January 9th. So it's not that the Iranian people don't know what the regime is capable of, but the level of discontent is so high and the economic situation is so dire that I think at some point, sooner or later, the protests will resume.
You've seen an increase in the tools of repression and surveillance, though, right? I mean, the way they're responding, even the aiming at eyes, which they've done in the past few rounds of protests, they weren't doing, to my knowledge, let's say back in 2009, 10, and so on. That the tactics are becoming increasingly brutal, and I imagine that the tools for surveillance, they buy the most up-to-date technology from other countries. How do you see that playing out in terms of future protests?
Yes, I mean, surveillance technology, that's a big concern. The regimes, they, for example, they force people during the war. They shut down like WhatsApp and Telegram, and so people were forced to use the messaging services that are basically designed in Iran, right? They're domestic messaging services. So they have intensified their attempts to surveil people and control them. So that's a major challenge, and protesters, they have to always be vigilant so that they wouldn't leave traces of themselves online. And it's a cat and mouse game, and I think as surveillance intensifies, protesters also learn new ways to evade detection. But overall, yes, it is very difficult, and I think they also they import these technologies from China, for example, and China, of course, is an expert in this. So it is a big challenge. But at some point, when the number of the protesters is just too large, hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people go out, then surveillance itself won't help them. Then they have to resort to just shooting, and then we have to see what happens. Whether people can overcome them or not. But it's going to be very, very difficult because they have shown the extent to which they're willing to kill people, and they have no qualms about it.
So you publicize the President of the United States was engaged and talked a lot about the protests and the casualties in January. And then the world's interest went away. I mean, even before the war, you could argue, war started February 28th, but already in February, it's not what people were talking about necessarily a lot in the West. What do you think's missing? What would it take to get global attention to really focus on the brutality and not, massacring people and suppressing dissent and so on?
I don't know if there is a method that could be deployed to draw attention to it. The fact of the matter is that I believe Western media, and I would say even Western political culture in recent decades have been identity based. So the political discourse in the West really, sometimes I would say, is obsessed about identity issues, right? So, for example, I think the 2022 protest, Woman Life Freedom, I think it received more attention despite the fact that the number of the people who were killed was far less, because it was about women's rights and compulsory hijab and and maybe to some extent you could say patriarchy and those issues that are identitarian, and a Western audience might find them more relatable. Even as I said, during those protests, like in one day they killed 100 people in Zahedan, but that didn't receive much attention, despite the fact it was the deadliest incident during those protests. What received attention were the stories of young girls who were kidnapped and killed, and their names became household names, but the names of the people who were killed in Zahedan are not known publicly. Why? Because I think the media, they're looking for stories that they can sell to their customers, effectively to their audiences, right? And those stories that have to do with identity, whether it be gender or ethnicity or race, those tend to sell better, for lack of better terms. In 2022, the protests were about regime change. The protesters came out and they wanted to overthrow that government and bring in a new system. That story, I think, is not. It's harder for, I think, a Western audience to find that story relatable, because that's not what people in the West do. They don't go out to the streets to. They might protest the policy, but they don't go out to the streets aiming to overthrow their governments. It's not something that it was maybe done in the 19th century, or sometimes in 20th century as well in some Western countries. But in the U.S. and Western Europe, I'd say that's not the thing that people think about. So it's harder for them to relate to. So I think that's just the nature of it, and we can't really change that. I mean, us as a human rights organization, we do our best to draw attention to the executions and the killing of protesters and you name it. But whether something draws more attention to that, it's beyond our capability, I think.
I know in the past you've issued reports about specific communities, Christians or people converting from Islam to Christianity in Iran, members of the LGBT community. Have those reports resonated? Have people, because you mentioned identities, and as you know, a lot of what the regime does is it does in fact focus on specific communities. I mean, those two groups, Baha'is, it does have specific, it's certainly no fan of what it might perceive as ethnic separatists, such as Kurdish activists and so on. Can you talk us through a bit about kind of how the regime focuses on those communities and how that has resonated in the West?
Well, the regime, they have various reasons to crack down on different communities. For one thing, the regime doesn't tolerate any organized activity of whatever sort. So labor unions, because it involves organization, they crack down on it. Religious communities, because Christian converts, Baha'is, even Sunnis, because it's a different order and there's a different organization, they crack down on it. They don't want any competing organized activity in the country. Even if like 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, I remember a bunch of youth, they'd organize and they gathered in the park to have a water pistol fight, right? And the regime cracked down on them and arrested them. Why? Because they don't like any organized activity. So they crack down on it. And with respect to LGBT persons, of course, that goes to the ideological precepts of the regime. So of course they crack down on them and persecute them as well. As far as uh, those issues, being talked about in the media outside Iran, yes, I mean they get some coverage, of course, but those are issues that happen all the time. The persecution of Baha'is and LGBT people and Christians. It's not just one instance of 100 people being killed. It's an ongoing event that has been going on for more than 4 decades now. So it's different in nature from a protest that suddenly thousands of people are killed, in 2 days. So I don't expect them to garner as much attention as those events that are nationwide public protests. But if you want to compare those protests, I would say that comparing the 2026 and 2022 is interesting because despite the fact that violence in 2026 was much higher, in my estimation, it received less attention than 2022 because one of the reasons is that 2022, at least 2022 was also about regime change. Don't make a mistake, but the event that led to the protest was the killing of Mahsa Jina Amini because of lack of proper veiling, and then the protest, it was called Woman Life Freedom. It was to some extent about women's rights and women's liberation. So that was an issue that was relatable and relevant to contemporary debates in Western societies, which to a great extent are about identity. And also, like, she was from Mahsa Jina Amini was from Kurdistan region, so that one was also she was also a member of an ethnic minority, so that was also relevant. But in 2026 we had a nationwide protest for regime change, and the person who was leading the political movement, like, was a former crown prince, and I guess some people in the West, they took it as a sign that they didn't, because of the history of the Pahlavi dynasty and its ties with the West. Maybe it's, for some people, it's difficult to relate to that because they feel that that's a return to a state of affairs in which there's a government in Iran that's has close ties with the West, and it brings up those types of stories of previous centuries of imperialism, whatever. But the fact of the matter is that the people in Iran, they wanted regime change, and there was this crown prince who was former crown prince who is outside Iran, who's calling for protest, and people responded to that call. So that's the story. But maybe because of those considerations, in the West, there was more hesitancy to cover it as compared to the 2022 movement.
Do you ever worry? You look at the Lego kind of videos that are put out, and that the regime has both an overt and a covert propaganda operation. I mean, it's involved in social media across the planet. It has its narrative spreading all over the place. Sometimes it does it surreptitiously. It's akin to, let's say, Russia's efforts, and sometimes it does it quite overtly with the Legos and so on. And of course, it has its own narrative, as you know well, that it says that the people who were killed in January were Mossad agents. And I mean, just the whole narrative of this isn't real, this is being stirred up by the West. Do you have any concerns that that narrative is taking hold or will take hold amongst people in the West?
The concern is that people in the West, they see the events across the world through their own prism, through their own political lens, if you may. So, whoever is president from either party, in the U.S., half of the population who voted for the other party are not likely to like that president. So for their own political reasons, they might enjoy, a jab at that president, and the question of, okay, where is this jab coming from? It's coming from a regime like the Islamic Republic. Then the fact that where that jab is coming from becomes irrelevant to them, and they don't think about it because they just enjoy to see their political opponent being humiliated or being made fun of. It takes some vision and sound mind and discipline. It takes discipline for a person in the West who is critical of Trump to think about the fact that, okay, I may not like the president, but this Lego video is being originated by a totalitarian regime, and it's meant for propaganda purposes, So the audience in the West, they should have discipline, to think about, okay, or this is a piece of propaganda that I might find it interesting, it might validate my my political views, but its origin is actually from Russia, so I should be careful about it and not propagate it. But I think few people have that discipline, from either party. I think, as I said, most people in the West, they think about their own domestic affairs, and that's their main consideration. So and regimes like the Islamic Republic and Putin, they take advantage of these divisions in the West, and they use it to their benefit.
So as we draw to a close, let me just finish on a note of hope. And I'm going to ask you, what gives you hope? You deal with depressing stuff. I mean, documenting human rights violations in Iran, it can't be a very fun thing on a day-to-day basis because these are human rights violations. It's not a happy situation. Do you see hope? Do you have hope?
Well, I have to have hope. But, even in the darkest days when I am feeling hopeless myself, I do remind myself of the path we've taken. 10 to 15 years ago, I'd say most people in Iran, they still had the idea, they believed in the idea of reforming the Islamic Republic. I was opposed to that idea from the get-go. I knew it was not possible and this regime is not reformable. But I think until 2017, a plurality, if not a majority of people in Iran, they believed that it was possible. People would go and vote in elections held by so-called elections held by the Islamic Republic as late as 2017. And I had friends who would vote in those elections. Friends who didn't like the regime, but they thought, okay, Rouhani is better than Raisi, and they would still go take part in that sham elections. But now, I think that era is over. The delusion that this regime can be reformed is over. Now, I think the vast majority of people in Iran, they want this regime gone. So we've moved one big step forward. Now, as to how this regime is going to go and how it can be replaced by a liberal democratic order, that's a very difficult thing to do, given that this is a brutal regime and it has access to vast wealth due to proceeds from exporting oil. So it is going to be very hard, and they're armed, and the people are not armed. So it is going to be very difficult. But what gives me hope is to think about the path that we've come, and so that gives me hope that maybe unexpected things can also happen in the future.
Shahin Milani, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Idris. Thank you. Glad to be here. Thank you.